How do you win back working people when you no longer understand how they see the world? Writing on June 2nd, 2026, a political scientist looks at 50 years of polling data to answer a question that still drives campaign strategy. Why did the working class abandon the Democratic Party? The standard progressive answer is that the party failed them on trade and wages. But this piece holds up because it looks past the usual economic talking points. Instead, it tracks exactly how the two groups drifted apart on basic questions of fairness and government trust. It offers a quiet, data-backed look at a cultural divide that no tariff can fix. Written by Nicholas Jacobs, Goldfarb Family Distinguished Chair in American Government, Colby College, Institute for Humane Studies, in The Conversation, narrated for ARVA. Since 2016, when Donald Trump shattered the Democrats' blue wall by winning working-class voters across the Midwest, a cottage industry has sprung up on the left dedicated to answering a single question: how can Democrats win back the working class? The answers come in different forms. Sometimes it is veteran Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, barnstorming red districts, railing against oligarchy and corporate greed. Or it's Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who after the 2024 election declared, "Democrats must reclaim our identity as the party of the working class." Or the answer comes from a new generation of candidates, tattooed veterans, mechanics, bartenders, whose biography is supposed to do the political work that policy has not. Graham Plattner, the Maine Senate candidate, who has become the left's latest blue-collar savior, put the theory in its most unguarded form. "We are in a form of class war," he says. And if the Democratic Party is going to have a future with working people, it needs to pick the side of working people. How does he define the working class? Essentially, everybody who isn't making all their money on an immense amount of wealth. The theory is all the same. Somewhere out there is a latent working class majority, held together by shared economic grievances, waiting to be politically reassembled to vote for Democrats. The New Deal did it. Democrats can do it again. I'm a political scientist who has written extensively about rural and working class communities. I believe it is an open question whether these reformist Democrats are really interested in understanding working class voters on their own terms. Because working class voters, as they tell us themselves, are not simply waiting to be activated by the right program, the right messenger, the right phrase. Fight the oligarchy probably isn't going to do it. Working class voters have a worldview. For 50 years, it has been growing less compatible with the Democratic parties, not because working class voters changed, but because Democrats did. Working class identity. Since the early 1950s, the American National Election Studies has asked respondents whether they think of themselves as members of the working class. This article uses my analysis of that data. While a larger proportion of the electorate has obtained a college degree and household incomes have risen, the share of Americans who consider themselves working class has remained remarkably stable, roughly 35% of voters for the past 70 years, 38% in 2024. Working class identity is something more durable and culturally grounded than a description of who isn't a billionaire. It is a specific way of looking at the world. There are conventional ways to define the working class, but they often miss how people understand their own place in society. In the 2024 American National Election Studies, for example, 21% of those who identify as working class have a college degree, only 5% belong to a private sector union, and 37% own stocks. Conversely, most Americans without a college degree do not identify as working class. Working class voters have never been a predominantly Democratic group, not even at the height of the New Deal coalition. Based on the American National Election Studies self-report measure, the working class share of the Democratic coalition peaked around 56% in 1960 and has fallen more or less continuously since, sitting at just about 30% today. Meanwhile, the share of working class voters who identify as Democrats has been declining for half a century. A majority did so in 1958, but not since. Working class voters have not become Republicans. Only in 2020 and 2024, the first time in the survey's history, did more working class voters identify as Republican than Democrat, and even then by narrow margins. The data shows a working class that is politically homeless, estranged from the Democrats, not captured by the Republicans, stuck in the middle with diminishing attachment to either party. Economic abandonment. So what drove them out? A segment of the progressive left has a ready answer. Democrats abandoned working-class voters economically, on trade, wages, and industrial policy. Working-class voters responded rationally. Fix the economics, and the coalition comes back. Trade is where the argument is strongest. In 1988, roughly 74% of both Democrats and working-class voters groups favored limits on imports to protect American jobs. By 2024, only 26% of Democrats favored limits, while a majority, 54% of working-class voters, continued to do so. Unlike most Democrats, many working-class communities do not see globalization in their interest. Running alongside the trade gap is a widening divide over values that no tariffs can fix. What fairness requires? In 1984, Democrats and working-class voters broadly agreed that treating people more equally would mean fewer social problems. A divergence opened after 2008 and accelerated after 2016, with Democrats now 28 points more likely than working-class voters to think we should worry more about equality. In 1986, half of mainstream Democrats and a slightly smaller percentage of working-class voters agreed with the idea that Black Americans don't succeed because they don't try hard enough. By 2024, Democratic agreement had collapsed to 13%. Working-class voters declined too, but to 32%. The gap that opened between them is not primarily a story about rising working-class racial resentment. It is a story about the Democratic Party's rapid post-2008 shift toward a worldview that places far greater explanatory weight on structural barriers and far less on individual effort and personal responsibility. Working-class voters, who historically have understood their own lives through a framework of hard work and earned reward, did not shift so dramatically. Alignment becomes division. On cultural questions, the pattern persists. Working-class voters did not move right in reactionary revolt. Democrats moved left. In 1986, similar levels of Democrats and working-class voters agreed with the statement, this country would have many fewer problems if there were more emphasis on traditional family ties. By 2024, a 25-point gap emerged. On whether religion is an important part of their life, a near-zero gap through the early 1990s, but 17 points by 2024. On abortion, a 3-point gap in 1980 became 30 points in 2024. Regarding whether immigration levels should be increased, the two groups were virtually identical in 2000, around 8% support. But by 2020, Democrats were at 48%, working-class voters at 24%. But even where working-class voters nominally agree with a Democratic policy goal, they don't trust the institution being asked to deliver it, a distrust decades in the making. How the system plays. In 1958, working-class voters and Democrats were within 5 points of each other on whether government wastes a lot of tax money. By 2024, that gap reached 27 points. Not because working-class voters lurched toward anti-government extremism, but because mainstream Democrats became dramatically more trusting of government as an instrument of social change. Working-class voters are 17 points more likely than Democrats to say people like them have no say in what government does. In 2024, 88% of working-class voters and 75% of Democrats said government is run by a few big interests. Both groups agree the system is captured. Yet the Democratic policy response, invariably, is to expand the system. On support for expanding government, from healthcare to jobs to environmental programs, Democrats and working-class voters have diverged dramatically since the 1980s. By 2024, there were approval gaps of between 20 and 30 points on providing government health insurance, environmental spending, and a guaranteed jobs program. On every major plank of the progressive economic agenda, Democrats are now substantially to the left of the workers they claim to champion. Not all class war. Working-class voters have been telling pollsters for 60 years that the political system doesn't hear them. Democrats, over the same period, have grown more comfortable with the institutions working-class voters have increasingly less faith in. This distrust is the accumulated residue of specific experiences: deindustrialization that happened on government's watch, trade deals that economists endorsed and workers paid for, a 2008 financial crisis response that saved the banks and foreclosed on their homes, an opioid epidemic that regulators missed entirely.
To be fair, this is precisely what the new crop of reform candidates say they want to fix. The argument that the right candidate can move the needle is not crazy. Candidate quality matters. Personal trust can substitute for institutional trust, at least at the margins. But economic grievance politics is a very small slice of what working-class voters are telling us. The data documents a comprehensive, decades-long divergence in how working-class voters and mainstream Democrats understand fairness, government, personal responsibility, and social change. Reducing that to class war jams working-class voters into a prefabricated progressive agenda, rather than taking seriously what they are actually saying.